What's up, guys? I got a special treat for you.
This is about why the Titanic may not have sank.
Today we're looking at some more Titanic TikTok conspiracy theories.
Oh God!
TikTok never disappoints. I found another one, a really good one for you, so I want to take this theory apart and we're just gonna see if there's any truth to it. So we're gonna take a look at a TikTok today that is talking about the Titanic Federal Reserve Theory. Now you may be wondering, what the heck is the Federal Reserve Theory? Well, why don't we let this TikToker explain to us? Okay, so I actually recognize this girl from the previous video where we debunked conspiracy theories, so she doesn't really have a good track record with these videos. And I don't mean to pick on her, but it's just, you're the one making these videos, so let's watch them.
Here's something so crazy that it really could be true. This is about why the Titanic may not have sank. Now this is part 2, so go check out part 1 first or you're gonna be lost. Alright, caught up? Let's go. Now I'm gonna give you some background before you understand this theory. This is the Federal Reserve. And even though it's called the Federal Reserve Bank, it's actually privately owned by the world's elites. Quick little side note to make this theory even crazier is that out of all of the presidents in the United States, only 2 have tried to take them down. Mr. Abraham Lincoln and Mr. John F. Kennedy. What do those 2 also have in common? They were both murdered. Now you may be asking, well, what does this have to do with the Titanic? The Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, 1 year after the Titanic sank. A lot of people did not want this to happen. Specifically 3 people who could afford to fight this. Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, and John Jacob Astor. Back then, they had enough money that in today's time, it would be billions and billions of dollars. Not only did they hold enough power to stop the Federal Reserve, on April 14, 1912, they all died on the Titanic.
Okay. Where do we begin? Well, good news and bad news. The good news is that there were a few things in there that are actually factual, that are indeed true. Bad news for her is that the majority of it is not factual. So we're going to go ahead and debunk this theory. But before we jump in, I want to remind you guys to hit that like button and to subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about the Titanic, history, and disasters in general. So if you guys are into that, then this is probably the place for you. I also want to give a huge shout out to all the new Titanic nerds that have recently subscribed. And I want to send especially a huge shout out to Titanic nerd Erica Rogers. She writes, I've been fascinated by Titanic since I was 5 in 1994. Your channel is super fun for the long dormant part of me that nerds out over this disaster. Thank you for educating us. Thank you so much, Erica, for being a Titanic nerd. Okay, so let's go into debunking this theory. I do want to say that in this particular video, we're not going to be talking about, the merits of the Federal Reserve. We're not going to be breaking apart whether I think the Federal Reserve is good or bad. That's not that type of video. I'm going to be breaking apart the claims made specifically about the Titanic and the Federal Reserve. So the question that is being asked is, did JP Morgan sink the Titanic on purpose in order to create the Federal Reserve? So let's take a look at the claims in the video.
Now you may be asking, well, what does this have to do with the Titanic? The Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, 1 year after the Titanic sank.
Okay, so this part is true. So I commend her on that. It is true, the Federal Reserve was created on December 23rd, 1913, with the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. And yes, it was created a year after the sinking of the Titanic.
A lot of people did not want this to happen. Specifically 3 people who could afford to fight this. Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim.
Quick point, it's actually Guggenheim, by the way, but carry on.
And John Jacob Astor. Back then, they had enough money that in today's time, it would be billions and billions of dollars. Not only did they hold enough power to stop the Federal Reserve.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Everything that was just said is not true. I know. We were doing so well up until this point. So the thing with this theory is that the whole theory is based off a false premise. The proponents of this theory, they love to bring up this particular meme. Basically, it shows the 3 wealthy men, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, I don't know why it says Isa Straus, but it's Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor. And the meme says, all these 3 men oppose the Federal Reserve Bank. And then it goes on and says, today these men would be worth $11 billion. All 3 of these men were aboard the Titanic when it sank. All 3 died that night. Okay. Yeah, so this particular image has been going around the internet a lot, actually. People saying that, look, these three men were on the Titanic. They opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. So JP Morgan had the ship sunk on purpose, knowing that these three men would be on there in order to eliminate the threat. Okay, so who even was JP Morgan? JP Morgan was an American banker. He owned a company called the International Mercantile Marine Company, and that company bought the White Star Line. So JP Morgan was the owner of the Titanic.
A lot of people did not want this to happen. Specifically, 3 people who could afford to fight this.
The only problem with this theory is that they didn't oppose the creation of the Federal Reserve. The entire theory is built off of the assumption that they opposed it, when in reality, they did not. First of all, there's no written evidence that either John Jacob Astor or Benjamin Guggenheim opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. And actually, Isidor Straus publicly endorsed the idea of the reserve. He supported the creation. He even wrote 2 different articles in the New York Times in 1911, which is very well documented. As you can see here, Isidor Straus came out publicly in favor of the creation of the Federal Reserve. So the entire idea that these men didn't want this bank to be created, that's false. So the theory is not off to a good start.
On April 14, 1912, they all died on the Titanic.
Okay, so now this point right here is always very interesting. Yes, these 3 men all died that night on the Titanic. And as we know, the theory states that JP Morgan intentionally sank the Titanic in order to make sure that these men would be murdered, that they wouldn't be around in order to oppose the creation of the Federal Reserve. The only problem with this is that how would JP Morgan have ensured that these men died? None of these proponents of this Federal Reserve theory ever answer the question. There's so many questions that come up. Okay, if JP Morgan did in fact orchestrate this entire plan, number one, how did he get the Titanic to hit the iceberg? Did he tell the officers? Why would the officers listen to him? How would the officers have been kept quiet? Did he pay them off? Nobody ever brings up a theory as to how this would have been done in the first place. Second point is, how would JP Morgan have ensured that those 3 particular men died that night? We know that there were other prominent, important businessmen that were on the Titanic and they did in fact survive. For example, Bruce Ismay survived that night. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon survived that night. So there was no guarantee that Astor, Guggenheim, or Straus wouldn't have survived. Survival really depended on many different factors. Where you were that night, what side of the Titanic you were on, whether you were on the starboard side or the port side. We know that Murdoch on the starboard side was indeed letting men on. There were so many different factors. There was absolutely zero way for JP Morgan to have guaranteed the death of these 3 particular men. These are some very simple questions that the theorists can never answer because they don't have an answer. It seems like really bad planning for JP Morgan to go through this entire elaborate scheme to get these men murdered and then not be able to A, guarantee that the Titanic would sink, and then B, guarantee that those men, his opponents, would not survive the disaster. The other thing about this is that the theorists always mention that JP Morgan had this plan and then he canceled his ticket on the Titanic minutes before or the day before, which we know that that's not true. We looked at this point in detail when I debunked the Olympic switch theory. And you know what? The Olympic switch theory is a much better story. This here with the Federal Reserve, there's way too many plot holes in it. At least the Olympic switch theory seems somewhat plausible until you start looking at the actual facts, but at least it's a better story than this one. And if you guys are interested in that theory, which is probably the biggest Titanic conspiracy theory, you can check out this video where I debunk the whole thing. It's pretty fun. And yeah, that's pretty much the Federal Reserve theory. There's not much to it. We know that the entire thing was built off of false information. And then on top of that, there are no details as to how the actual theory, how the plan would have been carried out. And then on top of that, there's other questions that we could ask. Very simple questions. For example, if this is actually true, why has no one, not a single individual, come out and expose this? You would think that with such an elaborate plan, somebody along the lines would have said something, right? Because if we are to believe that JP Morgan somehow paid some of the crew to intentionally crash the Titanic into an iceberg, at some point, there's not enough money to cover them up, right? Somebody would have said something, either an officer, a crew member, some passenger that overheard something, even the employees at Harlan and Wolff. Thousands and thousands of employees, not a single person has ever said anything related to some secret plot by JP Morgan to intentionally sink the Titanic. The other interesting thing to point out is that even if John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, even if they oppose the creation of the Federal Reserve, there is absolutely no guarantee that had they survived, that they would have had any influence whatsoever. These three men alive, that would have done nothing to have stopped the creation of the Federal Reserve. We know that in the US House of Congress, in the Senate, there had been support building for some kind of centralized banking system for many, many decades. This was not a new idea. And we also know that in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, it passed with a significant amount of support. So there's no reason for us to think that had these three men been alive, they would have been able to influence it in such a way to stop the creation of the Federal Reserve. And that's assuming that they even opposed it, which we know that they didn't. So yeah, you know what? I think I actually ended up asking more questions in this video than we even got answers for. The main question is really, did JP Morgan intentionally sink the Titanic to create the Federal Reserve? The verdict on this one is no, absolutely not. It's a fun theory though. Actually, not really. It's not really fun. It's kind of a crappy theory. We broke that apart. This video could have been a minute long, actually. I apologize. It was fun seeing the girl on TikTok try to build support for that, but there's not much there. There's not much to this theory. It's very simple. The whole theory was built off a false premise. The guys that the theory is about, they didn't even oppose the creation of the Federal Reserve. Okay, so what do you guys think of that? Do you think that it was actually JP Morgan that sank the Titanic on purpose? Let me know down in the comments so we can fight. That was fun. If you guys want to see me debunk more crazy TikTok Titanic conspiracy theories, you guys can go ahead and click this video here. And if you're wondering whatever happened to Titanic's lifeboats, watch this video here. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys learned something new today and that I gave you something to think about. All the Titanic Guy merch is in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next one.